This video looks at the subordinating conjunctions of Old English and the way they are used to combine words, phrases and clauses into larger sentences. Alright. Now, a subordinating conjunction is a word or phrase that links a dependent clause to an independent clause. The dependent clause adds information about the content of the independent clause. Now, in the last video, we looked at joining independent clauses together. Now we're looking at joining an independent clause with a dependent one. So we want to add the dependent one on to the end or add multiple dependent clauses on. Okay. Now, an independent clause can stand on its own, while a dependent clause cannot. A dependent clause must be attached to an independent one, but an independent one can stand on its own, doesn't need any attachments at all. Dependent clauses can take the form of a subordinate or relative clause. The youth didn't want to fight, though he was quite strong. So the independent clause is the youth didn't want to fight, stands on its own, pretty clear what it is, subject, verb, and some objects. The dependent clause, this can't stand on its own, though he was quite strong. It's not a full sentence, it's not quite right. Okay, it sounds it, but it's not quite. He works so hard that he can provide everything we need. Okay, that he can provide everything we need is a subordinate clause, a dependent clause, which provides information about the independent clause, which a complete sentence, and the independent clause is a complete sentence in its own right. He works so hard. Now, subordinate clauses can interrupt the main clause or the independent clause. If he is good, the king who sits on the throne should distribute treasure. So the independent clause is the king should distribute treasure, clear statement, and then it's interrupted twice by if he is good, who sits on the throne. So it's interrupted by two dependent clauses, okay, two subordinate clauses. And the conjunctions here are if and who. In Old English, subordinating conjunctions change the word order in the second or subsequent clauses by sending the verb or verbs to the end of the clause. So dependent clauses send their verbs to the end of the clause. It's a different word order to the independent clause, and the independent clause could take the form of subject, verb, objects, or other forms, but subject, verb. Okay. The dependent clause is going to send all of its verbs to the end. Okay, now some examples of subordinating conjunctions: ar before ar tham or ar tham there, ar tham there before, Bhutan unless, for tham because, or for thu because, or for tham there because. So there's quite a few combinations you're going to find. So sometimes the one modern English word because is expressed by three words put together: for tham there, or for thu there, right? Or maybe just for tham, or maybe for thu. Okay. Okay, so you've just got to look out for that. There's a bit of variation there. If is if, hawater, whether, nemthe, unless, thar, hawar, where, yes, thar, which you thought was there, can also be where when it's a subordinating conjunction. Thas there, after, that, thatter, that, so that. After tham, after tham there, after, again. Theik, though, or theik there, though, so watch out for both those. Thenden, while. Thider, or thider there, whither. Thona, when, then. With there, provided that. Thanon, whence. Thar, when. Thar huila there, while. Sawa, as. Sawalche, as if. Sithan, after. Nu, now that. Off that, until. There are some other words there are some subordinating conjunctions. There's not a complete exhaustive list. I have missed some. You just got to play it by ear. Pay attention to the sentences that you're writing or speaking. Okay, here we go. And she then encouraged him and taught that he should forsake secular life. So here we've got a coordinating conjunction and. We've seen all that in the previous video. It doesn't alter the word order. So we've got we've got subject, then verb and object. Another coordinating conjunction, taught, and then a subordinating conjunction, that he should forsake secular life. So how do we turn all that into Old English? So ond heo hina tha monade ond larde that he world had an for later. An for later. Okay, so conjunction and, subject, object. Remember, pronominals can go together. So nominative and accusative. Heo hina, she, him. The verb then encouraged. Conjunction ond. Now notice here, between this conjunction and this subordinate conjunction, there's just one word, larde, which is past tense, taught. So teach is lar, and taught, the past tense of it, larde is taught. Now, this lad, it's she, the subject here is doing the teaching. Now, it doesn't, we could put ond heo larde, but that repetition is unnecessary given that this harks back to the last subject, to its antecedent. And the only antecedent available to this taught is she, here, over here, the subject. Okay, we could have put ond heo larde, okay, perfectly correct, but it's not necessary, it's redundant, because this verb can only relate back to its antecedent, which is the subject here. So you can drop off the second she. It's not necessary, okay? You can have it, it's not wrong, okay? Now, let's move on. That, he, world hard, compound word, an for later. Okay, now notice here, that, subject, object, and then the verb is pushed to the end. This is a subordinate clause, and verb at the end marks subordinate clauses. I water the plants because, conjunction, because they are dry. I water the plants, a sentence in its own right, clause can stand as a sentence in its own right, but then with a subordinating conjunction, because we can add further information, they are dry. Okay, so that's why we're watering them. So subject, ich lecher thawurta fartham hier daruya sind. Okay, notice in the subordinate clause here, subject, object, and then the verb right at the end. Whereas here in the main clause, the independent clause, the main clause, okay, which can stand in its own right, you have subject, verb, object, the normal word order. Okay, ich lecher thawurta fartham hier daruya sind. Okay. Next bit. I did it so that you wouldn't cry. So that is a conjunction. I did it. Subject, verb, object, full sentence in its own right. Subject, verb, object. Ich dude hit. I, first person, past tense, singular, dude. Ich dude hit. Okay. Why? Okay, well, we're going to add some extra information now. So, swath that. So that. Thul ne wepa. You, not weep. Verb at the end. Well, there's only two words in this clause, so there's no choice. The verb has to be in the second place, which is the end. So, thu ne wepa. Okay, new subject. That's you in this clause here. Okay, it's a separate independent clause. Not independent, sorry, separate dependent clause. It depends on this. Okay, so that you wouldn't cry. Okay. All right. Now, where am I off to next? The youth didn't want to fight, even though he was indeed strong. So the youth didn't want to fight is an independent main clause, can stand on its own. That's it. Okay, so subject, verb, object. Ze kan niet nolde vechten. And now comes the subordinate clause, because we're going to add some more information. Theek there, even though. He wel satarang was. Okay, so subject, verb, subject, object, sorry, whoops, and verb at the very end. Okay, he wel satarang. was. Okay, he indeed strong was. So, zeer nicht wolde vechten, the he wel satrang was. Okay, the youth would not fight, even though he indeed strong was. Okay, I don't know whether I should go. Whether is a subordinating conjunction. So the independent or main clause at the front, I don't know. Ich neer witten or ich naht. Okay, I've explained that in the previous video. Then the subordinating conjunction, whether, whether. And then we have subject, and now we've got two verbs. Should, which goes to the end. First verb conjugated at the end, schule. Okay. Second verb go is in the infinitive, so it goes second from the end, second last place. In its infinitive unconjugated form is gone. So I, first person present tense singular. First person present tense singular for should is schule. So the conjugation is first person present tense singular, schule. I should, and then go. Okay. Now, so the verbs all go to the end here in the subordinate clause. This is the main clause, the independent clause. This is the subordinate clause or the dependent clause. They wanted to seek out Godwin's army if the king wanted that. Okay, so I lifted this from some original piece of Old English text. So we have the subject, verb, object. The second verb goes to the end in its infinitive form. That's the main or independent clause. Then we have a conjunction if joining it, and in the subordinate clause or the dependent clause, the secondary clause, you have subject, object, and a verb at the very end. Okay, so here Waldon Godwinus vierde Jesekan, Jif se kuning that Walde. Okay, so they wanted, so plural present tense. Okay, plural present tense, Waldon for wanted. The object is Godwinus vierde, army, accusative, and the infinitive verb to seek out is Yesekan. You may see it some places Yesechan, so different dictionaries will give you different spelling, but Yesekan or Yesechan in the West Saxon dialect. Conjunction if, subject se kuning, object that, if that's what the king wanted, that thing he wanted, in this case an object, and wanted Walder. Okay, past tense. Now, I'm going to bed early because I have to get up at 5 a.m. Ich ga to bed for thumb ich at 50 reason schule. Okay, now here we have in the independent main clause, primary clause, whatever you want to call it, ich ga to bed, subject, verb, time, indirect object, all that sort of stuff there. Then the subordinating conjunction, for thumb, because, for thumb, because. Then we have the subject, now we have time. The verb here, have to, it goes to the very end in its conjugated form. I, first person singular, present tense, schule, have to. Infinitive here, get up, reason, a verb, put that in the infinitive form in the second last location. But notice all the verbs at the end for the dependent or secondary clause. Okay, all at the end. To say at 5 a.m., at 50, at 5 a.m., at the 5th hour. Okay, next one, you will be punished unless you reveal the truth plainly to me. Okay, so the subordinating conjunction there is unless, and that is Bhutan. Okay, now, thu shalt ythreiched werthan Bhutan thu me sawertolicha soth yakude. Okay, so thu, you, second person. So we need second person present tense, which is shalt, you will, for will, which comes from the verb willan. Now, shulan. You shall be, you will be, shalt, willan, shalt, ythareiched, werthan. Okay, so you will be punished. Will be punished. Will and be are two verbs. Then yathareached. Yathareached. Werthan. Okay, Bhutan thu me sawetolicha soth yakuda. Now, in the subordinate clause, the secondary clause, the dependent clause, you have the subject, indirect object, object, and then you have the verb right at the end. And that's different to the primary or independent or main clause, where you have the verb in second place and then any further verbs at the end. Okay, that's the difference. And the subordinating conjunction makes that happen. You have normal word order in the main clause. You have verb last order, that's subject and then words in between and then verb at the end in the subordinate or secondary or dependent clause. Thu shalt yathareached werthan butan thu me sawetolicha soth yakude. All right. I don't know when he, she, it will come home. So you've got three different sentences in there. When we can use thona for the subordinate conjunction. First sentence, ich newat or ich nat. I've covered that in the previous video. I'm not doing that again. Subject here in the secondary or subordinate clause. He, heo, hit. He, she, it. Harm, home. Yukuman, willa. Now, willa here is third person present tense will. So that is willa, third person present tense, willa. And then the second verb is come. So that's it in infinitive form in the second last place here. All right. So all the verbs at the end, it's a subordinate clause. Ich nat thona heo he hit harm yukuman willa. They vowed to him that their king would accept baptism. So this is referring to King Alfred's defeat of the Danish Vikings at the Battle of Edington, and how King Guthrum and his noblemen were forced to accept baptism. So they vowed to him, King Alfred, that their king would accept baptism. So hear him Yeheton, that hiera kuning, fulwichte onfon walde. Okay, so that is the subordinating conjunction. You then have the subject, the object, and then both verbs at the end. Now, the first verb would, is walder in this case, so past tense, okay, plural, past tense, walder in this case, and then accept in its infinitive form is on phone. All the verbs at the end there. Hiera, which is a plural because the A on the end. The A on the end marks it as plural, all right? An E on the end would make it singular and would make it her, okay? But this A on the end marks it clearly out as plural. Here we have subject, indirect object, him. Him is the indirect object. It's in the dative, okay, whether it's singular or plural, so you just have to in this case, this use here is singular, whereas him can also be plural as well. The verb conjugated, yeheton, that's vowed, which is present tense, plural, present tense, third person, present tense, sorry, third person, they, present tense, yeheton, vowed. Hier him yeheton that hier kuning fulwichte onfon walder. Okay. They to him vowed that their king baptism accept would. Und hier alle onthonne kuning waren vechtende of that hier hinna of slayene have done. Okay, now off that until is a subordinating conjunction, and if you notice here in this clause here, it is a subordinate one. You've got all the verbs at the end, plus you've got the fact this is a subordinating conjunction. So this is the secondary or dependent clause, and this one here is the primary or independent clause. Okay. They all against the king, Cunewulf in this case, were fighting until they had killed him, killed Cunewulf. And this comes from the story of Cunewulf and Cuneherd. Okay, und hier alle onthonne kuning waren vechtende of that here hinna of slayene have done. Okay, so they all, is the subject in the nominative there. The object is on von König, so it's against the king here. Von marking it as the accusative, so it's the object. So straight away, von König is the object. The verb conjugated, warun, okay, and the past participle, because remember we're talking here, this is an action that's been completed in the past, so we're using the past participle of the main verb, which is vechtende, okay, that's a past participle of fighting, vechtende, and this verb here, conjugated warun. Okay, this one, the subordinating conjunction off that, and then the subject here, they, the same as this they up here. Hina, him, in this case, him, it's the accusative hina, so it's the singular accusative, so we know it's him, he, the king. To kill, that's the infinitive verb in the second last place. The first verb conjugated because it's the subordinate clause. So had, they, goes down here. Him goes down here. Had goes here. Have done, first verb conjugated. Had, past tense. Plural past tense. Have done. And then kill or killed, afslayene. So this is in the past. This is the infinitive unconjugated verb, but because the have done is past tense, it marks this as he has been killed. It's something that's happened in the past. All right. Sada hey that hey hina kanik wesende yasawe. Okay. Said he that he saw him being a servant boy youth. So someone's relating something they've seen. They've seen this individual acting as a servant or acting as a boy or acting as a youth or what have you. Okay, and they're recording that. Said he. Okay, this sounds like a statement because it's beginning with a verb and then a subject. Hey is actually, that should be red up there, not blue. I made a mistake. Whoops, I forgot to change that color. Subjects are in red. I've always got them in red. This is a subject. This is a nominative. I've always got the nominative in the red. Said he. Anyway, subordinating conjunction that, he, the object, hinne knecht wesende, him being a servant boy youth, saw, the verb at the very end, past tense. Okay, second person past tense, yasawe. Okay. Rule 9. A subordinate clause has all of its verbs at the end of the clause with the first verb conjugated and in the last position and the second unconjugated verb in the second last place. And if there's any other verbs, they'll go in the third last place, unconjugated in the infinitive form, and so on if there are even more verbs. Okay, now let's see what happens when we swap the order of the independent and subordinate clauses. Okay, I've been starting with the independent clause or main clause first, then a subordinate conjunction, and then the independent clause, okay? As in this first example, you know that, subordinating conjunction, I love you, okay? So what I've been doing at the moment is in the main clause, subject, verb, and so on, okay? Then I've been putting the secondary dependent clause, all right, at the end. But we don't have to do it that way. We can actually put this entire dependent clause right at the very beginning. Okay, so this saying here, you know that I love you, common phrase, okay. Thu wat that ich the luvie. Okay, well, this ich the luvie, including the word that, which is the subordinating conjunction, all of that can be lifted and put in the front. Okay, so we can go that ich the luvie, comma. Okay, but now what we have to do, if you look at the first main clause, we have to make a change there. The subject and the verb have to swap place. This is just a rule. It works. The subject and the verb swap places. Okay, so the verb goes now first, the subject second. So what happens is you have the verb at the end of the subordinate or secondary clause lined up with the verb, the first verb, of the main or independent clause. So they're right next to each other. Put a comma. Okay. That ich the luvie, comma. What thu, know you. That I you love, know you. And that's the same thing as you know that you love. You know that I love you, you know. This makes sense. You know that I love you. That's common. Put the subordinate clause to the end. We're used to that. But really, is it really confusing if we actually said that I love you, you know? Is that really confusing? Not really. It's not, is it? Okay, we could do that. Now, notice that subordinate clause is separate. The subordinate clause is separated from the main clause by a comma. Just notice that subordinate clauses will tend to be separated by commas, but not always. You will often see it in Old English text that there's a comma and then the subordinate clause follows. The point of this present slide is to show you that we can take the subordinate clause, the whole clause, including the subordinating conjunction, and stick it right at the front. Okay. Let's see some more examples. Okay, we could not have won if, subordinated conjunction, we feared them. So, we ne kudon yasi haben, if we follow the rules that throughout these videos, if we here on the redon. Okay, now notice the comma there, then comes the subordinate conjunction and the subordinate or secondary clause. Okay, we ne kudon yasi haben, if we here on the redon. Now here, nekudon, could not. We have subject, we, then the conjugated verb, then the object, which is victory. This is in the accusative. It's a noun here, an accusative noun. You see, victory. And then have goes to the end here, and that goes in its infinitive unconjugated form. Okay, haben, to have. Okay, comma. Then the subordinating conjunction if, and then we have the subject, we, in the nominative, here, which is the accusative, them, and plural, accusative plural, here, and then the first verb, which is feared, the first verb conjugated. So fear, the past tense of that, plural, is onderedon. Past tense plural, onderedon. Okay, feared. Past tense plural. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to take that subordinate conjunction, that secondary clause, that dependent clause, and shift it to the front. So we take the whole lot as is, we don't change anything, and stick it all on the front, put a comma in. Okay, so if we here on onderedon, nothing's changed. But now the primary clause, the main clause, the independent clause, this one here, we have to do a slight change. The verb and the subject have to swap places. So that in the final sentence, the verb of the subordinate clause, the secondary clause, sits right next to the verb of the primary or main clause. Okay, separated by a comma. So what we now have to say the same thing is if we here on the redon, nekudon we yasi haben. Okay, nothing's changed except that we've taken the secondary clause, put it out front. We've taken the primary clause and swapped the verb and the subject. In the first two places, they've swapped place. And that's the rule. I will not go unless you go. Ich ne wulle gan buton thu gast. Okay, so subject, verb, infinitive, because there's two verbs here. Ne wille is the first one, not will, and gan is the second. So ich ne wulle gan, I not will go, unless thu gast, unless you go. And the conjugated for that, for second person past tense, is gast, singular, past tense singular, gast, is go. All right, now, this secondary clause here, headed by Bhutan, let's stick this out the front. We want to do that first. Maybe we want to emphasize this fact. Unless you go, I not will go. Unless you go, I won't go. Okay, we want to maybe emphasize that, so we're going to stick that first. So, Bhutan thu gast, comma, ne wille ich gan. Okay, unless you go, not I will not go. Okay, so conjunction, subject, first verb conjugated, so the subordinate or secondary clause, no change there at all, just moves to the front, okay, comma on the end. But the original primary clause, the main clause, the independent clause, has to swap verb and subject, ne wulle ich. It's the only thing you have to get used to. Let's do it. You just have to get used to it. That's all there is to it. They can swap places because you want to emphasize what's in this secondary clause. You want to emphasize it. Okay? I'm not going to go. Unless you go, I'm not going. So, you know, that we want to emphasize that, so we can stick that first. Unless you go, I don't want to go. All right? So we can emphasize that by putting it first. Buton tu gast ne wula ichka. Okay. All right. Although you want to afflict sufferings upon it, my body is referring to this as a passage here, you cannot touch my soul. Okay. Theek. Now, this actually comes from a piece of Old English writing. So, and it was, it's in the Old English time, whoever wrote that, they put the subordinate clause first, then the primary or main clause second. Okay, and what we're going to do now is rewrite it in its usual form with the subordinate clause second. So, okay, so this comes from an actual piece of Old English writing. Okay, so theek, which is a subordinating conjunction. Ye hina sarum for sechan. Okay, near motan ye mina saula garetan. Okay, although you want to inflict sufferings upon it, you cannot touch my soul. So although you want to inflict sufferings upon my body, you cannot touch my soul. Okay, so what we want to do now is, how about we write that in the more usual form? You cannot touch my soul, comma, although you want to inflict sufferings upon it, my body. Okay, so we could write that as yea, take the yea here, put it down the front, near moton into second place, near moton, mina saula garetan, comma, and then the subordinate clause, the whole subordinate clause here goes in here. Theek the ye hina sarum forsechan. Okay, so what we end up is ye near moton mina saula garetan theek the ye hina sarum forsechan. Okay, you cannot my soul touch if you my body sufferings upon want to afflict. Okay, now if you notice here in the subordinate clause, theek the ye hina sarum forsechan, the verb appears, the only verb appears right at the very end, hinting that it's a subordinate clause, along with the fact that you have a conjunction preceding it, a conjunction preceding it. So that's the subordinate clause. But how the text itself actually appeared in the Old English text, from wherever the authors have got this from, the subordinate clause is first. So it's just showing an example of this rule, that it did apply in the Old English time. Okay, not that you find many examples like that, because mostly when we write sentences, we put the subordinate clause where it belongs, at the end, after the main clause. But you can. This is here an example from writings from the Old English period that shows that the subordinate clause is at the front. Okay, so normally we'd say ye near moton mina saula garetan theek the ye hina sarum forsechan. Okay, and this bit here is the subordinate or secondary clause. All right, so I think I've emphasized that enough. Move on. Rule 9, the entire subordinate clause, including the conjunction, can be placed in front of the independent clause, perhaps because you want to emphasize what's in the subordinate clause. The subject and the first verb in the independent clause must then swap places. So here's our main clause here: subject, verb conjugated, object, infinitive verb unconjugated. That's if there's two verbs. There's our subordinate conjunction. Then we have subject, object, indirect object, anything else, and the verb, the first verb right at the very end. Okay, so here's our subordinate clause. We're going to stick it out front here. Conjunction, subject, object, indirect object, nothing changes. The verb at the very end, comma. Then we're going to have the verb from the main clause first, then the subject, so that those two things swap places, object, infinitive verb unconjugated. Okay, that's that. And another one of these pictures I like to end on: a family in a longhouse, and rather large longhouse, and sitting around doing the things they do. And I guess looking at the image there, we can get some idea of what they might be talking about or saying, or we can imagine the words they might be using. perhaps some of the words outlined in this video, I hope. Anyway, certainly a different world to ours, that's for sure.